Hi everyone, and welcome to this new video in which we continue our close reading of Dialectic of Enlightenment by Theodor, Adorno and Horkheimer. Today we continue reading from the last chapter of the book, Notes and Sketches, which is a collection of fragments by Horkheimer, which basically give the outline of a theory of fascism, like how we get to fascism. So far we covered three aspects of the theory: the relationship between man and animal, so domination over nature, then the stupidity that results from this domination, because when men dominate nature, they also dominate themselves. They also dominate their own bodies, they mutilate their own bodies, and we talked about how this stupidity breeds isolation and how the media fuels this isolation with propaganda. Today we're going to talk about the fourth aspect of this theory, which is terror. Like how from isolation fascism breeds terror, and what kind of terror we are talking about. So the fragments collected here are about that, and we will start with the longest one because it is directly related to everything we read so far about the mutilation of bodies, about isolation, and more precisely about the atomization of society. So terror starts with that when you atomize society, when you further isolate people from one another, and as the authors will argue, the atomization of society basically models society on prisons. Like the criminal, like punishment must fall on the criminal, and the criminal becomes the prototype of the bourgeois individual. So the first fragment is about that. It's called From a Theory of the Criminal. So the idea of punishment seems to us to be self-evident, that it is a necessity independent of social structures and ideology. It is just common sense that when you do commit a crime, you must be punished. There is no ideology behind it. And so this reasoning rejects the thesis that punishment serves ideological purposes, that those who receive punishment are people whose interests conflict with the interest of the dominant group. So punishment serves ideology means that the purpose of punishment is first to maintain power structures rather than justice. So fascism actually has its roots in this, to view punishment as a necessity and deny its role in maintaining the power structures that produce inequalities and injustices. In other words, it produces criminals and then punishes criminals for being criminals. So it is important to understand what does it mean to be a criminal, like the historical category of the criminal, what does it do, and how it was created. And so the fragment that you're going to read now is about that. It's actually an extract from an essay by Horkheimer called Theorie des Verbrechers, Theory of Criminals. I'm not sure if I pronounced it right in German. You can find it in the 12th volume of Horkheimer's complete works, but it's only, it's only available in German, I think. And I couldn't find it, and so I couldn't get the entire text, and I couldn't translate it, so I'm just going to use the extract put in Dialectic of Enlightenment. But I did some research on Adorno and Horkheimer's theory of criminals in general, and it turns out that this text is related to another famous book that was influential in the Frankfurt Institute, and that book is Punishment and Social Structures, by two intellectuals of the Frankfurt School, Georg Ruschke and Otto Kirchheimer, again, not sure of the pronunciation, and it was published in 1939. And basically that book argues that punishment cannot be understood as an abstraction, but as a concrete practice. So what determines how that practice is going to be well practiced, it is the social organization of the process of production. What we produce, how to produce it, how to distribute it, why and who gets to decide on all of that. All of these elements form the process of production, and people are organized according to it. So when punishment occurs, it's always in relation to this process. Someone is a criminal because their actions went against this process. And since this process relies on social structures that has a hierarchy, the criminal is basically someone who threatens that hierarchy. So the rich benefit from the process of production more than the poor. The rich want to maintain it that way, so the rich punish whomever threatens that hierarchy. So punishment should not be seen as a response to crime, but as a result of class struggle between owners and non-owners of the means of production, a struggle primarily fought over the labor market. So the conclusion from this is that the socially shared perception that punishment benefits society as a whole is actually an ideological distortion. It masks the real nature of punishment as an expression of class struggle. So there has to be a relationship between forms of punishment, ideology, and changes in the economy and society. So when societies change, when the economy changes, the form of punishment and even, the content of punishment change as well. If societies grow poorer, punishment becomes more cruel because the point of punishment is to make the criminal worse off than those who didn't commit the crime. But if most people are poor, and what a coincidence that most criminals are poor, then they have to suffer worse conditions than the ones they were already in. And when the population grows poorer because there are less jobs, the supply of labor increases, but that causes a further decline in wages. When you have higher rates of unemployment, the boss can't hire everyone, so in order to hire everyone, he's forced to lower the wages. But if you lower the wages, the living standards get worse, so the population gets poorer, and as their standards get worse, conditions in prison must also worsen. Again, the point of punishment is to make you suffer worse conditions than the ones that you were in when you were outside the prison. And so this would be the basis for Horkheimer's essay, and more importantly, this fragment, to show how the category of the criminal is a historical category. It has a history and is related to an ideological context, which they explain at the beginning of the fragment. In the beginning, they write, like the criminal, imprisonment was a bourgeois affair. In the Middle Ages, incarceration was reserved for the offspring of princes who symbolized an inconvenient hereditary claim. Criminals were tortured to death to instill a respect for order and law in the mass of the population, since the example of severity and cruelty teaches the severe and cruel to love. Regular imprisonment presupposes a rising need for labor power. It reflects the bourgeois mode of life as suffering. Okay, so let's unpack this. So first, Horkheimer is specifically talking about punishment in bourgeois society, which takes the form of imprisonment. In other words, prisons are basically a new thing. They come to be a wide institution with bourgeois society. Before that, imprisonment was not for criminals. It was only reserved for illegitimate noble bloods who were seen as a threat to the crown. When a prince impregnates a mistress, for example, the child, if they start claiming legitimacy to the throne, they were imprisoned. So as for criminals, meaning people outside royal courts, their punishment was basically torture, often in public, so that people get scared and stay put. That's how princes, kings, and priests show love, by the way, through severity and cruelty. Now, the reason why in the Middle Ages you had these two forms of punishment, you had imprisonment for the offsprings of princes and kings, etc., of nobles, and torture for criminals, was because the target of punishment is different in each case. Physical punishment aims at bodies, whereas imprisonment aims at the soul. What does this have to do with the rising need for labor power, you say? Well, because the bourgeois revolution brought about individualism, which means that now people must be responsible for themselves. Enlightenment, if you remember Kant's famous phrase, enlightenment means coming out of tutelage, to be responsible for oneself, to use one's own intellectual faculties without relying on others. Well, this implies that from now on, it's not through the bodies that we punish, but through the spirit. There is no point in using physical force on someone, since that doesn't guarantee that they will be free thinker, quite the contrary actually. So we had to do it in a different way. Now, punishment is not about violence, but about rehabilitation. We want you to think in the right way, and from that, you'll be a free thinker that contributes to society. So imprisonment is like your parents who ground you in your room. We're not going to hurt you, but we're going to isolate you so that you think about what you did. So criminals are no longer seen as people who must fear power, but as people who need rehabilitation. And so this correlates with an increase of labor demand, because now people must work in order to produce what the bourgeoisie will consume in their idleness. In other words, the going out of tutelage by Kant becomes to mean you are free in the sense of you must work to contribute to society. So each individual is therefore now valued insofar as he produces something. This is the meaning of being free and responsible in bourgeois society. And it is precisely addressed to each individual, not to collectives. Individuals are atoms that must be kept apart, each producing, contributing to society on their own, the society in which they want to be free. And so this corresponds to the bourgeois mode of life as suffering, because freedom means, from the bourgeois perspective, suffering. Suffering in the sense of we are alone, isolated, and each one of us must work hard. But more concretely, what's the ideal of bourgeois society? They say the rows of cells in a modern prison represent monads in the true Leibnizian sense. The monads have no windows through which anything could come in or go out. Accidents cannot separate themselves from substances, nor go about outside them as the sensible species of the scholastics used to do. Thus, neither substance nor accident can come into a monad from outside. The monads have no direct influence on one another. Their lives are regulated and coordinated by God or the prison administration. Okay, so let's go through this. Leibniz was a German philosopher, and he is known among many things for his monadology. So in short, Leibniz argues that consciousness is a single unit. That's a monad. It means one. And the monad in Leibniz is just one substance. It doesn't change unless, unless inwardly, and has no parts whatsoever. This isn't really monism. Leibniz doesn't say that there is only one consciousness, but each individual is a monad. But monads cannot affect other monads. My consciousness cannot have any effect on your consciousness, so we are completely isolated from one another. And this monad is quite similar to a prison cell. It is closed off, it is closed on itself, has no doors, no windows, no access to the external world. It's like we are literally trapped within ourselves and don't know what is happening around us. We cannot know, we cannot act on the outside. Well, we can know things, but that's because God has given us knowledge. Leibniz was a rationalist, meaning that he believed that we are born with innate ideas with which we can have some knowledge about the world. And so the idea of Leibniz may come off as weird now, but it is related to Descartes' mind-body problem. And we will do it justice when one day maybe we go through Leibniz. But for now, let's go with this boiled-down version. Monads cannot have any impact on the world, but it is undeniable that we are moving, that we are doing things. Like our mind, our consciousness cannot have an impact on our bodies. When I move my fingers, for example, to type the script for this video, when I move my lips to when I move my lips to read it, it's not my mind that is doing that. The monad has no power over my body. So this must be the doing of something else, and it is God. God is making me move, he's making me write the script, and he's making me saying these words. What is happening in my mind, like the intention of doing these things, the feeling that right now I am commanding my body, is just a harmony between the two worlds, harmony that God is responsible for, of course. So everything is coordinated by God, both substance and accidents. When Leibniz writes, accidents cannot separate themselves from substance or go outside them, he means that my substance cannot command my accident. Accidents, if you remember, is the material world, or how the material world appears to us. Since to command it, it must be separate. The substance has to be separate from the accident in order to command it. Like, for example, the pilot has to be separate from the plane in order to fly it. But since nothing can come in and out of monads, then you cannot command anything. The sensible species mentioned in the extract are perceptible forms, like this phone, for example. This phone is emitting forms that I can perceive, and so the scholastic philosopher, meaning philosophers of the Middle Ages, they theorize that we perceive things because the things emit forms that really travel through the air and enter our sensory organs, and from the sense organs they travel to the mind, so to the monad, which then can do the same thing. And so in this sense, monads can influence each other when it is about people. When I perceive people, your monad is sending sensible species that my monad receives through the senses, and so I can do the same. I can command you with my speech, for example, with my tone of voice, my body gestures, my clothes, etc. In Leibniz, however, this is no longer possible, since monads are first separate from each other and even on any other thing in the outside world, including my own body. They are separate from even anything else, even the body. My body is like the plane, remember, and the pilot has the illusion that he is in control, but in reality it is God that is flying the plane, and he's making it avoid any collision with other planes or hitting mountains or stuff like that. So when you travel and the pilot lands the plane and everyone claps, actually you are clapping not the pilot but God. He is the one who kept you safe during the whole flight. And so this model is transposed to society itself. Power must coordinate movements like God. So prison administration becomes its foundation. Everyone must be like a criminal in jail, isolated from others, from the social world, unable to communicate with his peers. He must conform to the administration plan. It is power that moves him, that makes him go to work and work on assembly lines in unison. So the harmony between workers and with the machines that they are working on is a realization of the divine harmony. So the criminal is the one who threatens this. He threatens this fixed harmony. It's the one who doesn't accept to have his individuality diluted in this reductive nothingness. The monad, as the authors write, is a self whose whole being consists in the mastering of material and the monotonous rhythm of work. So basically the soul must be aligned with God's plan, otherwise it is led astray and must be cured and rehabilitated. What happens in prisons is seen as a purification of the self, of what is in the inside. So the criminal has failed to perform on the outside because he is not in harmony with the outside. Inside, his soul is in disharmony with his assigned role in the process of production. So societies are like that. They are prisons in which we are living in isolated cells. Bodies are prisons indeed. They force us to adapt to them, to arrange ourselves to them, and the failing to conform means that we are deficient. And so the bourgeois ideal has a lot of internalized violence and hatred. People are in prison even though they are not incarcerated. And those who are outside the actual prisons turn their own self-hatred towards those in jail. Like, I'm not in prison, but the guy who is and has committed a crime against me receives all of the suffering that I have inflicted on myself in order to conform to the social order. So for me, a prison is a tool to remind the criminal, you are not better than me. Like, I'll be bringing you down with me, you know. So prison means that you are not escaping from the invisible prison, the social order. As they write, the weak, the retarded, the brutalized must suffer in modified form the order of life to which others have lovelessly adapted themselves. The introverted violence of the latter is grimly repeated against the former. The criminal, in whose crime self-preservation was paramount, has in reality the weaker, more labile self. The habitual offender is an enfeebled being. And so that is very interesting to reveal the double bind of fascist society. Fascist society empowers you as it weakens you. The criminal, the one who challenges the social order, does it in the name of the social order. Like, the criminal is actually admired because he's the most conformist, actually, because he is applying the principle of self-preservation to its paramount form. I mean, the criminal is precisely the one who thinks about his self-preservation before anything else. And remember that the principle of self-preservation is the foundation of the modern social order. So the criminal is the one who plays by the rules of the game in the most fanatic way. The fascist social order actually glorifies the criminal because he is the most loyal servant to the social order. And therefore, by being the most loyal, he's also the weakest. He has the most labile self, meaning the easiest self to break. He is an enfeebled being, meaning a weak and feeble being. So the more you try to break the rules of the social order, the more you play by its rules. And the more you play by its rules, the more powerful you get, while at the same time you get weaker. All of your actions are captured by the system and turned into its own flavor. It invalidates you and everything that you did. Prisoners are invalid. Their weakness has brought them into a situation which has undermined them in body and mind and continues to do so. So the weakness of the criminal, which is of course caused by caused by the system leads the criminal to commit the crime. Since society itself is a prison, then from birth people are criminals. Those born in the lowest class of criminals will of course be the weakest, the sickest. Being the low lives as they are fated to commit crimes and then be brought into the institution that undermines even more severely their body and mind. So the prison simply continues the job of outside society, only harsher. What the criminal has shown is his potential for loyalty. He proved how much he needs and values self-preservation. All is needed now is for power to pluck its fruits. The plight of the criminal, his pain, his anger, his hatred, are all taken by the prison system to use as weapons. Prisons tell you, you have a great potential, but too bad you are sick, we will cure you, and now this potential for self-preservation, we will put it in good use. So criminals simply show their willingness to commit to self-preservation, and the prisoner is the criminal being brainwashed into using that commitment for the sake of power. So in other words, there is nothing more malleable and controllable than someone who lives by the principle of self-preservation, nothing more likely to be nothing but an instrument of power than someone who lives by that principle. So their weakness makes them unable to resist power, whether as victims or agents of power. Because Adorno and Horkheimer, they claim that there are three types of criminals, quote. Most were already sick when they committed the crime, which put them in prison sick through their constitution and their circumstances. Others acted as any healthy person would in the same constellation of stimuli and motives, but were simply unlucky. A residue were more malevolent and cruel than most free people, as malevolent and cruel in their persons as the fascist world rulers are through their positions. So for most, criminals are sick, and that sickness drove them to crime. Sickness can either be because of their own bodies or because of socioeconomical circumstances. Others are criminals through unluck. They are not sick, they were just unlucky. They got with the wrong crowd, in the wrong place and the wrong time. But there are others, a small minority, a residue, who are just malevolent and cruel. They're like the fascist world rulers. So you can say that not all criminals are in jail. Some manage to get away, and they can become the executioners of those who are in prison, as they say about today. I mean, today's their time, the 40s. The boundaries between respectable and illegal rackets are obviously fluid. So what Horkheimer is getting at here is that those who don't commit a crime that earns them the place in jail are just lucky. Power diminishes individuality. No one's fate is between their hands, but it goes according to the circumstances. Like monads, they have no power over their existence, and their action is directed by God, who can do the same with any other monad. Take me or you and put me as a monad in the place of a criminal, I'm most likely to commit the same crimes. So we are prisoners of our circumstances, and that's why for Horkheimer, prisoners are always talking about their circumstances. It is less in order to find excuses for their actions than to affirm that they are loyal servants to power. They have no identity, no individuality independent of it, and independent from it, and if they have, it's an identity that can leave no trace in the real world. So the crimes of the criminals are like cancer, a misfortune that falls on you like a house that suddenly collapses. No matter what you do, it's not up to you what you become, but to your circumstances. Imprisonment is a lingering illness. This is revealed by prisoners' expressions, their cautious gait, their circumstantial way of thinking. Like the sick, they can talk only of their sickness. So imprisonment only reinforces and reaffirms that the criminals were being taught what the criminals were being taught all along, that they are invalids. Their inner existence, their monad, has no reason to be. The only thing that matters about them is precisely their sickness, their circumstances. In other words, criminals have no agency, despite having, despite being driven by self-preservation, which only confirms that self-preservation confers no agency to anyone, by the way. It leads individuals to give in to God's plan, or in this case their circumstances, to power. They say the strength to stand out as an individual against one's environment, and at the same time to make contact with it through the approved forms of intercourse, and thereby to assert oneself within it. In criminals, this strength was eroded. So the individual loses all power to have any impact on their surrounding or environment. This is the paradox of individualism, the paradox that by claiming the existence of the individual as a monad, you strip it of its power. We are individuals in the sense of a monad. We are completely inoffensive. And this is where the paradox accentuates its into pseudo-individuality. The strength that was eroded was actually the thing that individualism itself rejected, and that is mimesis. Freud called this the death impulse, Calois le mimétisme. So it's important to explain what we mean here by death impulse, since we already mentioned it, but we will come back, but we already explained it, actually, so we can talk about mimesis. So mimesis, if you remember, means to imitate. Horkheimer mentions Roger Caillois, a French sociologist who, in the book Le Mythe et l'Homme, argues that it is by biological drives that we imitate our environment. Like insects, insects imitate their environment by having colors or forms that look like tree branches, leaves, or, predators. And so culture for human beings works in the same way. We imitate our environment. Imagination, which gives rise to myths, since Caillois is primarily concerned with the nature of and function of myths. So imagination is an instinct in us. We do it because it allows us to mimic our environment. Myths are supposed to be just that, reproduction, mimicry of the natural world. However, individualism is predicated on the idea that individuals do not imitate, right? We do not reproduce pattern. We don't do what everyone else is doing. We be ourselves. But what individualism has created is a culture of imitation. That's what we have seen already with the culture industry, for example. Everyone mimics everyone, despite claiming that we live in individualistic societies. So there is something that went wrong. And Adorno and Horkheimer, they argue that what went wrong is that we thought that mimesis was an obstacle to individuality, while it is mimesis that actually guarantees it. So the criminal is precisely the one who doesn't imitate, who doesn't mimic, and by refusing to do that, by claiming to an ideal of authenticity, he actually imitates to the core. The authentic criminal is more inauthentic, more submitted to influence than to those who believe in superstition and magic. The reason why mimesis is rejected by modernity is because it is associated with superstition, with regress or primitive times. Like, when people mimic, they reproduce the superstition and the myths of their society without thinking about it. And because of that, because they keep repeating what the magicians, the shaman, the priests tell them, they remain in a state of ignorance and stupidity. To think for and by yourself means progress. That's coming out of tutelage, like Kant said. Those who don't remain in the stage of barbary, they remain close to nature, while the real dude dominates nature or leaves the state of nature. So more paradoxically speaking, the criminal, the one who gets caught, of course, is considered a criminal and must be imprisoned because he goes against this progress. The criminal is represented as someone who is still unable to think by himself, unable to know what's good for him. And so criminals remind us of the state of nature, of mimesis. They represented a tendency deeply inherent in living things, the overcoming of which is the mark of all development, the tendency to lose oneself in one's surroundings instead of actively engaging with them, the inclination to let oneself go, to lapse back into nature. So criminals are, by the standards of individualism, void of individuality. They have no sense of self. They are like animals. They are nothing more but the product of their surrounding, their environment. They are their environment, meaning that they do not exist. when you see a criminal, you don't see an individual, but economic forces, a social class, etc. So individualism and the myth of progress rejects the idea that we are the product of our environment. It refuses that we give in, that we let ourselves go, that we regress back to the animal state, to lapse back into nature. So the death impulse mentioned by Freud here refers to that, to dissolve into nature, to return into the womb, to be part of the environment. So development and progress require that we break free from that, but we don't get free, right? We just become a monad in the Leibnizian sense, which, as we've seen, makes precisely more vulnerable the individual to the environment. When people listen to the criminal who speaks of his circumstances, of his environment, and want him to break free from that, to be responsible, to be an individual, they are being misled. The system wants individuals to remain the product of their environment, even though it promotes the opposite. All the talk of breaking free from it is an illusion, a self-deceiving lie. So in the mimesis of nature, individuality was there by telling us that it isn't, and that individuality occurs only when we break mimesis. That's when the environment was unleashed on the individual. In magic, we had mimesis with individuality. In enlightenment, we had only mimicry with pseudo-individuality. We already explained how, mimesis guarantees individuality when we talked about the concept of enlightenment. So anything that can revert to mimesis must be guarded against or made inoffensive. Crime, but also superstition, art, philosophy, all of these have their ways of becoming unable to reach back into mimesis. Crime, through the current forms of labor, cannot reach mimesis. Art, as we've already explained in the culture industry and other chapters, cannot do much through the market. Superstition becomes religion, and philosophy becomes official philosophy. And still, mimicry is everywhere. The attempts of individualism to break free from nature have failed and keeps failing. Mimicry is still there, is still here, but it is without thought. It is mindless. When we look at people on assembly lines, for example, or in markets, in religious institutions, or in academia, all we see is the same thing: mindless procedures. Those they torture no longer die broken on the wheel over long days and nights, but perish mentally as silent, invisible examples in the great prison buildings, which differ from lunatic asylums almost only in name. So what individualism feared from nature, it is recreating in society. It still teaches us not to resist our environment and then blames us for not resisting it. The emergence of psychological types, for example, reflect this idea. On the one hand, the psychology of the criminal is mapped according to his environment. The rationale is that our psyche is nothing but a reproduction of our circumstances, but also our psyche is blamed for it. It is told to be the product of circumstances and then punished for being so. So while the relationship between psyche and economic circumstances has its advantages, as it shows that our psyche is not ahistorical, but has a historical and is a process, it is a historical process, it can also reinforce the double bind as well. The criminal is someone who got caught doing what he was told to do. Quote, the inability to say no, which causes the young girl to succumb to prostitution, also tends to determine the career of the criminal. He is characterized by a negation which lacks the power of resistance. So being unable to resist is presented by power as both a virtue and a vice. It is a double bind. So delinquency both imitates and destroys pitiless civilization, as they say. And that same civilization creates prisons and institutions to protect itself against that delinquency, the same delinquency that it is producing. In other words, civilization destroys itself while maintaining itself and tries to protect itself against itself by building infrastructures like prisons and asylums that imitate civilization while also destroying it. And this is what leads to fascism. In fascism, it is a return to the barbary of nature from which, fascism claims to have emancipated us. The denial of mimesis reinforces mimesis even more, and this time without any mediation, literally like in the animal kingdom. In short, fascism fascism is basically might makes right. It is the strongest who rules and who and has no respect whatsoever for laws or regulations. Even markets collapse. Civilization simply crumbles by its own doing the more it tries to assert itself against nature. The concentration of command throughout the production is causing society to revert to a stage of direct rule. As the detour of power via the internal markets of nations disappears, so too do intellectual mediations, including law. So the ideal of bourgeois society, where every dispute will be settled through mediation, through arbitrators and mediators, was just preparing the way for an even more ruthless barbary. Dialogue and transactions were presented as a way to contain egos gone rogue against hubris, but were actually only one step away from a breakout of savagery. And so as the people who, through the transactions of market and bourgeois society, were gaining more and more power, it was only a matter of time before they turned to direct violence to assert their interests and take what they want. So negotiation was just a way to get to a point where I can take without having to negotiate, where I can just destroy the other and get away with it. And this is what we said earlier about, the kind of criminals, those who are the majority, and that residue of cruel psychopathic ones. Ones are submissive to power, while the others are its agents. The fascist mass murderer has emerged as the pure essence of the German factory owner, no longer distinguished from the criminal by anything but power. So this one has now the monopoly, like this one criminal, the psychopathic one, the fascist ruler, has the monopoly over the social order, meaning that laws cannot touch him. So inevitably laws turns against those who are at the lowest level of society. Laws and means of arbitration are therefore reduced to instrument of terror. The law becomes direct governance, pure terror, losing even the appearance that it had always had under the market. So laws and regulations no longer apply to those who negotiated their way out of having to abide by such laws. Justice, as the exchange of equivalents, was a constitutive part of bourgeois ideology. But in fascism, which is intrinsic to that justice, simple and immediate power governs. Fascism has no need for any element of rationality because it has no need for mediation. With fascism, the boundary between legal and illegal banditry becomes fluid, and as a consequence, psychological types become confused. Like everyone's psychology is identical. What distinguishes between them is their power position. Only power distinguishes the fascist from the criminal, the ruler from the criminal. And as such, even the inalienable right to property is threatened. Laws and regulations were providing property to individuals, but as monopoly sets in through those same laws and regulations, property is no longer guaranteed. Rights are not the affair of society, but of individual private agreements. Like people between themselves can make agreements if they want to, but there is nothing besides their will that can enforce agreements between them. There is no mediation precisely. And so this, of course, means that that agreements will be based on power. You will only make an agreement if the other person that you are making an agreement with is your equal, has the same amount of power as you are. If they are below you in terms of power, there is no need to make an agreement. You just take their property. You just evict them. You just displace them, or you can just straight up kill them. So who has more power can impose his terms on the other. As they say, of the international and social contract, which fascism in its dealings with states is replacing by secret agreements, only the compulsion of the universal is allowed to apply in internal affairs, a compulsion its servants then liberally administer to the rest of humanity. So fascism replaces the international and social contract by secret agreements. If I want something from you, let's say that you have a house, that's your property, but I have more power than you. The social contract prohibits me to take away your house. But if that contract is replaced by secret agreements that I, of course, established, then since I have more power than you, I can force you into accepting my terms. the compulsion of the universal is might makes right. So that is being applied to internal affairs as well, and then it is administered to the rest of humanity. In other words, the whole world is now following the same principle of self-preservation. Might makes right. This principle is then reproduced throughout the entire globe and destroys everything suspected of superstition in its wake. And so from here, we arrive at another paradoxical conclusion, which is that fascism considers the very idea of crime and punishment as superstitious remnants and goes on to annihilate the recalcitrant. In the totalitarian state, punishment and crime are being liquidated as superstitious residues and a naked eradication of opponents, certain of its political goal, is spreading across Europe under the regime of criminals. So, for fascists, since punishment and imprisonment at least claimed that it is rehabilitating people because it is targeting the soul or the spirit, that itself becomes metaphysical and sentimental bullshit. There is no point to punish anyone in fascism because to punish means that you believe that people can change through the punishment. So for fascists, I don't need to punish you because there is nothing to punish. You either live or die. There is nothing for you to learn, nothing for me to teach you through punishment, and so this shows that the prison, as part of the bourgeois society, with its intention to attack the soul of the criminal, was less regressive than the direct extermination perpetuated by fascism. So in fascist society, one can no longer speak of the criminal as sick, despite its negative consequences, still had some form of resistance against unfettered fascism. Like social coercion on the individual was at least the last vestige of the social contract, which still allowed for the existence of individuals. The mediation allowed for some free individual space. But today, which again, it's the 40s, the time of Horkheimer and Adorno, with Nazism and fascist Italy, Spain, etc., even Stalinist Russia. Today, pressure and control are exerted so closely on the individual that there is no longer space for individual reactions. We buy, we wear, and think what we are obliged to by the culture industry and other means of social coercion. Bourgeois prison punishment still contained a claim, even if it is ideological, it is still a claim to transform criminals into individuals. Under the society of total planning, however, this is no longer necessary. The individual itself becomes superfluous, crushed by corrosive social coercion. And so this coercion is presented in its peak by the concentration camp in which prisoners aren't being punished, even though there's the inscription, work will set you free on the gates of Auschwitz. They are sent there to be annihilated, like there is nothing that is going to come back out of those gates. And so compared to this, asylums and prisons are seen as a blessing, as a nostalgia for the good old days. Like when we talked about advertisement, like there was the advertisement that at least was about the product, was about the function of the product, compared to today's advertisement, which is about itself, which is, today advertisement is about advertisement. So even though advertisement betrays truth in its old days forms, it had some leveler against advertising for its own sake, just like punishment, even though is fucked up, dressed an obstacle to unfettered fascism. It at least gave people a chance to transform themselves. But now, since punishment is no longer done through mediation, it is implemented to the individual's flesh and blood directly. We are so into immediacy that we punish ourselves, that we keep ourselves within prisons from the start. And so in other words, we have internalized direct rule, and the weak are those who simply cannot rule over others, who cannot submit and destroy others. So their only choice is to turn their destructive impulses towards themselves and annihilate themselves, which just spares the strong the effort. So hence the indifference of the fascist leader to the fate of those who die in mass genocide. They brought it on themselves after all for being weak. There is no point keeping them around with hopes that they will turn into good people. Their only chance at redemption is dying while serving the strong. As Horkheimer ends the fragment, he says, Their well-trained souls and happiness are as bleak as the prison cells, which the rulers can already do without, since the entire labor force of nations has fallen to them as spoils. The penal sentence pales beside the social reality. So, spoils means residue or waste. It means something useless. That is what individuals are reduced to, by the way. That is the social reality. The terror that individuals live under in fascist regimes, the terror of being dispensable. And so the next fragment will continue exploring this theme in relation to terror, and next fragment is called Quand Meme. So, fascist ideology is based on a certain belief that is widespread and been the norm for most of Western civilization, from Democritus, a pre-Socratic philosopher, to Freud. And that belief, according to Adorno and Horkheimer, is external pressure has forced human beings to overcome their own inertia to produce material and intellectual works. Now, in other words, what pushes us to move is external pressure. The natural world puts pressure on us by threatening our lives. We have to move because of the cold, because we need protection from wild animals, because we need food, shelter, etc. And so all of our work, whether material or intellectual, was produced because of nature's resistance. Because nature resistance means that nature puts obstacles that must be overcome in order for us to survive. In order to find warmth, human beings must break the cold. In order to have access to food, the human beings must fight wild animals, they must hunt, etc. So this resistance of nature is later transposed to society. In society, human beings are met with the same resistance as in nature, but here it is with class societies. It is with social classes. Social classes bring up obstacles that force people into motion. The upper class forces the proletariat, for example, to move in order to survive, to produce in exchange of a wage with which they can buy food or pay their bills, to have, warmth and shelter. So they have to fight the obstacles in order to find the slightest comfort. People therefore act in society like animals act in nature. They adopt the same tactics in order to survive, like when the weak tries to stay close to the strong for survival, and at the same time he is ruthless to those who are further away from the strong. Human beings act in the same way. People are gentle when they want something from those who are stronger, and harsh when the weaker wants something from them. So this basically means that everyone is to fend for themselves, because they cannot trust anyone. Every single thing in the world, both social and natural, is first and foremost seen as a resistance that must be broken in order to get what we need. People themselves become obstacles to our needs and our survival. They must be broken and reified again, over and over again. Reification means becoming a thing. It comes from the Latin res, which means things. So it is a process to become an object, deprived of freedom. So each individual therefore lives in terror of becoming the object of others, and so the only way out is to be the first to turn the other into an object. And so that is the consequence of terror, and it becomes necessary in order to create a civilization. Civilization means that people must accept to become objects in order to live together. Otherwise they will just be obstacle to one another. They will be unfettered forces of nature that know no bounds. So people will be killing, stealing, and raping one another if they are not broken. And so this is the conclusion that conservatives draw according to the authors. We are dangerous and we must be tamed like the forces of nature in order to live together peacefully. To live in civilization means to live in terror. And so the upper class keeps the lower classes in terror and fear of losing their small privileges, of losing, their chances at food and shelter. And it is because of that terror that they accept to conform, to comply, and to work. And so if people have their needs met without the terror of resistance, they will stop working and civilization will crumble, and we will be even more vulnerable to the state of nature, to the terror of nature. So the terror of civilization is like a terror that motivates us to move in order to protect ourselves from the bigger terror, that is the terror of nature. So terror for the conservative is necessary. It is the condition for civilization, which protects us from nature's terror, which is worse than civilization's terror. So for the conservatives, it is only through terror that people can develop themselves and perfectionate themselves. The terror imposed on the working class from the external social structures is a good thing, since it allows the working class to become better people. They say the conclusion drawn by conservatives that terror and civilization are inseparable is well-founded. What could enable human beings to develop the ability to master complex stimuli, if not their own developmental exertions, which have to be spurred on by external resistance. So the social structures in question are first embodied in the figure of the father. The father, according to the author, is the first entity from which we meet resistance in the social world. This is, of course, the psychological background of Horkheimer. The father is the resistance because the child already finds everything it needs in the mother. The mother is like the warmth we look for in nature, but the father is going to alienate the child from that warmth. He embodies the resistance of nature. He says no to the impulses and desires of the child to be with his mother. And it is only when the child manages to defeat his father that he can be reunited with his mother. And it is only when we defeat nature that we can be reunited with nature. We can only eat the fruits of nature after we have killed the animals. But civilization never allows that reunion. If reunion must be, then it must be parallel to the ever-going struggle against the father. Outside the family, the father is everywhere. Civilization makes sure that the resistance is never overcome because it argues that it is in that resistance that individual spontaneity is stimulated. So the figure of the father later grows thousands of heads, they say. You also have to meet the resistance of teachers, supervisors, employers, consumers, your peers, competitors, politicians, bureaucrats, representatives, etc. All of them are here to maintain the struggle against the father's resistance because civilization believes that it is only through this agonizing torment that people can develop their capacities. Spontaneity is only possible in castration, in impotence, according to the fascist. It is only when we are met with brutality that we can be spontaneous. The fascists worship spontaneity. Many people don't get that. They think that authoritarian regimes don't like it when people act spontaneously. In reality, for totalitarianism, spontaneity is only possible through a struggle against resistance. A spontaneity without resistance is not spontaneity for them, but a regression, a weakness, a vulnerability. Only babies are spontaneous without resistance. And babies die at first contact with nature. That is why they must be chased into the real world. Babies must be taken out of Eden and then some harshness in order and taste some harshness in order to become real individuals who deny their own drives and desires. As they say, culture has evolved under the shadow of the executioner. Genesis, which tells of the expulsion from paradise, and the Soirée de Petersburg are in agreement on this. So in Genesis, that's Adam and Eve were thrown out of paradise in order to work and know pain and suffering under the eye of God, the ultimate executioner, the ultimate judge. They must now wait for his commands, his laws, in order to enjoy themselves. And so only in marriage you can have enjoyment. Only when you have finished your Herculean chores you can enjoy some time of leisure. And even during that time, which is scarce, its point is to rest your body so that you can go back to work tomorrow. So you're not supposed to really enjoy it. Always remember that God is watching and judging you. And the other reference, Les Soirées de Saint-Pétersbourg, that's a dialogue by Joseph de Maistre in 1821, and it's about the government of Providence. So de Maistre was a conservative French philosopher who opposed Enlightenment and the French Revolution, and he believed that the only way for France to exist is under a monarchy. Don't think that counter-enlightenment means not fascism, by the way. As Adorno and Horkheimer explains, conservatives which are against enlightenment are only critics of enlightenment in name only. De Maistre is also an executioner, or at least believes in the shadow of the executioners. In his dialogue, it is providence, the idea that everything was already written in the stars. It is the maktub in Arabic. God has already decided on everything, and everything is unfolding following the divine plan of God. The point is, we have to live constantly under the shadow of our executioners. The only way to develop culture is under the authority of the Father. All pleasure and pain must be experienced under the gaze of the executioners. If we dare to dream of a culture that is not based on the principle of castration, a culture that is outside the shadow of the executioner, we are going to come off as crazy. Quote, work and pleasure take place under the shadow of the executioner. To contradict this is to fly in the face of all science, all logic. One cannot abolish terror and retain civilization. Even to relax the former means the beginning of disintegration. So we are trapped in a false dilemma. The Frankfurt School is often accused of being anti-civilization because they are anti-terror, while in reality they are defending civilization. For Adorno and Horkheimer, we didn't break free from the barbary of nature. Civilization is not here yet. But the reason why we are being held back is because we have this false belief that without terror there is no civilization. Again, it's a false dilemma. For conservatives and fascists, civilization is only possible if people suppress their desires and emotions, if they submit to the executioners. People must be slaves in order to build civilization. The amount of terror required to satisfy civilization is more a matter of paranoia and irrational fear than of reality. Like the slave holders who have been opposed to abolition because it will lead to the crumbling of civilization. We think today that the slightest relaxation of terror will lead to the end of civilization. It marks the beginning of disintegration. If we let people, for example, be open with, I don't know, their sexuality, for example, then it is the beginning of the end. I had a friend once who told me that if she ever suspected that her husband has sex with her just even once without feeling emotions, like at that moment, she will divorce him because that act, sex without emotions, means the beginning of the end. And it was impossible for her to conceive that people can have sex without necessarily making it about emotions, and it won't affect their marriage in the least. And she went trying to rationalize it, like trying to prove that it is a logical necessity, when in reality just out of fear that she believes that she has this sort of small fascist belief that there is no other option for humans to exist than to suppress sexuality, or to have sexuality in very controlled and managed setting. So emotions become the executioner's shadow in romantic love. If you try to have sex outside that shadow, if the executioner sees that you are going towards the light where his shadow doesn't reach, his axe will hit you. So in other words, in other cases, of course, sex becomes the shadow over emotions. Kind of like when men, for example, try to hide that they have emotions because it will make them seem weak or gay, or when people lose their shit because a gay or trans guy made a coming out video on the internet, and they will be like, our civilization is gone. So the point is that there is a terror that if we relax it a bit, whether it is in our love life, work, sexuality, morality, trust, etc., if we relax it just one bit, we will die. Like the point of Adorno and Horkheimer is the following: the most diverse conclusions that can be drawn from this, from the worship of fascist barbarism to a flight into the circles of hell. So that's an allusion to the Divine Comedy by Dante. It has three parts: Inferno, Purgatorio, and Paradiso. In the first part of the epic, Dante goes through hell in order to gain to paradise, to go to paradise. And hell is depicted as having circles, and he must go through all of them. And here Adorno and Horkheimer are referring to the third canto of Inferno, where Dante arrives at the gates of hell, and you have the famous writing on the gates that says, "Abandon all hope, you who enter here." If you enter hell, there is no way out of it. So what I think it says here, because I'm not really sure if I got the meaning right of this allusion, is that we are giving two choices. We either worship the fascist barbarism or try to escape it. We fall into the circles of hell. Or another way to understand it, by worshipping fascist logic, we end up in hell without the possibility of escape. But there is another way, and I think this may be the correct one, which is that we end up in hell, like in the previous interpretation, but this is something desired. Like we want to be in hell because there is no other alternative. That I think it's the second one that makes sense because of the asterisk. The authors are referring to the fourth line of the third canto, which is another part of the inscription of the gate. It reads, "Sacred justice moved my architecture." So maybe it means that there is no escaping terror because it is the product of a sacred justice. So by worshipping fascism, we must fly into hell because fascism becomes the sacred justice in question. So in short, fascism uses logic to justify terror, to justify hell. And so people who live there must find ways to only cope with the fact that they are in hell. So the only way for progress becomes just to look for how we can alleviate the suffering without getting rid of it. How can we make hell less hellish? Here again, you can think of psychiatry. You have people who get mentally ill because of hell, because of the social structures imposed by fascist logic, and so psychoanalysis tries to cure the patient by keeping them in asylums and sedating them instead of challenging the fact that the reason why people are fucked up is because, well, they are in hell. And so we want people to be better, but without taking them out of hell. Suffering and terror are therefore justified, and civilization's role is only to make that terror moderate. And so all of civilization becomes a giant sanitarium, which means an asylum, a place for the treatment of mentally ill people. That this harshness might be moderated in the future, that the bloody punishments by which humanity has been tamed in the course of centuries could be replaced by the establishment of sanatoria seems no more than a dream. So as they suggest, this project of moderating terror in the future is kind of bullshit. We think that civilization can itself tame the punishments that tames human beings. You know, like sports, for example. Imagine that instead of having people fight to the death in actual wars, you make them play, you know, highly competitive sports and so that way the terror will be moderated and inoffensive. But for Adorno and Horkheimer, whether you moderate it or not, that's not the issue. If you try to stimulate the resistance of nature into social games, that is still a simulation. It is powerless, as they say. The underlying reality is that people are in hell. The underlying reality is that people have lost all humanity. Hence they end the section with this provocative sentence: there is one other possibility, to scorn logic if it is against humanity. And so this is to say that the dilemma offered by fascist reasoning is a false one, as we said. There is at least another possibility, which is to value humanity. The worship of fascism throws away humanity, which for the authors is the most valuable thing there is. What matters is humanity, it's not logic. And so this again is taken as if the Frankfurt School are rejecting logic, but again, that's not what they are saying. What they are saying is, if logic works against humanity, if logic forces human beings into concentration camps, into literal hell, then logic must be scorned. So logic should work for the interests of humanity, for its happiness, not against it. And so this is the basis of critical theory. It is to promote the idea that there can be a civilization without terror, especially the kind of terror espoused by fascism, which the next fragment is about, and it is called vain terror. So the fascist view the fascist view is characterized by vain terror. That is, a terror of something the subject knows is coming. It is vain because, as we often say, there is no point of being afraid of the inevitable. The fascist is someone who predicts his own ruin and lives in terror of the day that ruin falls on him. The reason behind this, according to Adorno and Horkheimer, is that the fascist is seeking power to such a degree that he has to expect his downfall. In fascism, they achieve the synthesis of power craving and self-hate, and their vain terror is always accompanied by the qualification, "I always saw it coming." So the fascist hates himself as much as he loves power. The power craving of the fascist is too much of a burden. because it implies to be constantly fighting, always mistrusting everyone, always staying in control against an entity that you cannot dominate. If fascists always believe in conspiracy theories, that the world is out there to get them, means that they do feel insignificant and vulnerable. The entire world is hostile, and the only way to live in it is by brutally killing everything that lives. And so that attitude creates a terrible feeling of loneliness and paranoia. They are so strong that the only relief that can be experienced is when the fascist himself lets go and dies along with the rest of the world. You just give up because at one point you feel like a scorpion cornered by a ring of flames. You turn against yourself. And so Adorno and Horkheimer illustrate this with the example of a rich man who spends all of his life fighting ruthlessly for every single penny that in the end he just gambles all of his fortune away. Like we know about these rich people who suddenly do a very irresponsible move and lose everything. They give their money away without a fight, as the authors say, when they gather it with endless fighting. It's like all of the rationalization of their parsimony, their unwillingness to spend their resources, was a decoy for something underneath, the fear of something inevitable. When the rich writes books to give you tips on how to save money, the underlying psychological impulse is you are going to waste it. To waste all of it, eventually you will cause your own ruin. The rich man's behavior is a precursor for fascism. So the endless pursuit of power, besides all of the heavy psychological burdens it puts on the individual, has another dark side. It forces the power-craving people to always witness calamities. Like when we see an accident on the road and we cannot help but stare at it. Now imagine when you also know that you have caused it. It is on a scale of millions, like millions have died in it. The power craving of fascists and rich people means that they must always stare at calamities with a secret complacency. Their hands are soaked in blood, and from here they build up their myths based on the tragedy of the hero who lost everything because of his own actions. So strong are the social bad conscience of all who have a pan in injustice and the hatred of fulfilled life that in critical situations they turn directly against self-interest as an imminent revenge. So fascists and power-hungry people want only one thing: their own ruin. They see it as the only justice in the world. Justice for the fascist can only be attained in the ruin of the fascist after he ruins everything. So that brings fascists, what brings fascists together, what the nationalist core of the Nazis, for example, isn't the love of the fatherland, but their hatred for themselves. They are all alike in that regard, and they love one another for how much they hate each other. Their resemblance is in the fact that they share the same logic, the same tragic fate. We are all going to die, and they see in it a triumph, even though it will bring their ruin. Quote, indeed, they took their own ruin as evidence of the justice of the order they represented. And I think a great illustration of how you end up a fascist is within the next entry, the next fragment, Animal Psychology. So this next one, well, in the 1947 version of the book, it is placed right after the note Quand Meme, which we just read. But in 1944 it was moved after Against Knowingness, which we went through when we talked about stupidity. I don't know why it was displaced, it's not explained, but anyways. So, in this note, Adorno and Horkheimer introduced the image of a dog about to cross a highway. They say that if he goes in, he will get rolled over. But it is going to go, but the dog is going to go in because the dog has a peaceful look on his face, like it's not at all concerned with the roaring cars that drive up and down the highway. It's like the dog thinks that nothing can hurt him. And so Adorno and Horkheimer use this as a sign that the dog was always taken care of, and so it wouldn't think that someone or something would want to hurt him. He was always being looked after, he has a peaceful, a peaceful pet that nothing ever harmed. So having no idea of what harm is, the dog walks in and gets rolled over. And so the authors then compare the dog to the sons of the upper bourgeoisie and indicate that they are like the dog, except that they don't have the peaceful expression on their face, despite that they are looked after better than the dog. They say, do the sons of the upper bourgeoisie, whom no one harms, have peaceful expressions on their faces? They have not been worse looked after than the dog, which is now run over. Like, you know how spoiled brats of rich assholes are always, frustrated and can get and only get satisfaction when they run blindly into a highway. Like Adorno and Horkheimer talk a lot about how fascism is a regression, and so it is appropriate to try to understand what is going on in the mind of a fascist through animal psychology. Adorno and Horkheimer also say that in the vain Terror Fragments, that the fascisation process, people's running to their own ruin, is also present in French bourgeoisie. Although I don't know what they are referring to here, and it's not really explained. Maybe it's the Dreyfus affair, but anyways, or maybe because the collaboration between the regime of Vichy and the Nazis. But anyways, they say that you have the same thing in French bourgeoisie, a fascination for the fascist heroic ideal. They do talk about France in other fragments like Monuments to Humanity, to which we turn now. So they say that France provided great monuments to humanity, so much so as they write, humanity has always been more at home in France than elsewhere. Like the French made everything in higher and better qualities, I guess, like they knew how to make achievements and produce noble things. France knew how to distinguish itself and preserve its specificities, the things that make France, I guess. Among them, they list singing, literary style, the cuisine, brothels, and cast iron urinals. But then they write, but the Blum government already declared war on such respect for the individual, and even the conservatives did little to protect its monuments. So the Blum government was the Front Populaire of the Prime Minister Léon Blum during the 30s. Blum held office and he launched economic reforms that turned out to be catastrophes. He introduced the 40 hours a week, paid holidays, and increased wages. All good policies in their own right, but they also caused a huge inflation, which led to actual decreases in wages. The asterisk mentions the years 36 and 37, which are the years in which Blum made those social reforms. So I guess that the criticism here is that Blum's increase of purchasing power made everything cheap, and according to Adorno and Horkheimer, when you make everything cheap, then you devaluate it. We talked about this in the cult of cheapness in the culture and the industry, so maybe he's referring to that. And of course, conservatives who always complain about decadence and degradation of culture do only that. They just complain about it, and then they will support economic policies that degrades their culture even more. So they continue even more to complain. And there is nothing running towards fascism faster than a conservative who complains. So, I don't know, I'm not really sure what Horkheimer and Adorno's deal with the French here. Like maybe they're referring to Pierre Florent, a French physiologist who they discuss in the note Le Prix du Progres, to which we now turn. So, in this fragment, Le Prix du Progres, the price of progress, they discuss a letter from Florent in which he discusses the use of chloroform when you perform surgery on patients. Chloroform was used as an anesthesia. It makes people be invulnerable to pain. They can't feel pain, so we can operate on them. They, of course, have to be unconscious. But Florent, in his letter, argues that that's not what chloroform does. Instead, while it paralyzes people, they still feel pain, perhaps more under the drug than when they are awake. But chloroform has another effect, which is amnesia. It makes people forget what they felt during the time where they were under the influence of the drug. So we've been told that people are not feeling pain, but in reality they are just not remembering the pain that they felt during the surgery. And that's what's interesting in this letter. Quote, if we told our patients the truth, it is likely that none of them would opt for the drug, whereas now, as a result of our silence, they generally insist on its use. But he also adds another more troubling fact about the drug's use, given that people are not told that it just makes them forget what they felt during the procedure, and not that it makes them invulnerable to pain, and so people would think it's morphine and ask for it. And so Florence says that we probably would use it more for more complicated surgeries and operations. And he fears that given the lack of training in medical academic institutions, we would have untrained surgeons performing risky and extremely delicate surgeries, which will cause incredible pain in the patients, and more alarmingly, we can use human beings instead of animals for experimentations if we use chloroform. And so, all of this, the chloroform, along with surgeries done by newbies and weird experimentations, can cause severe and undesirable, unreversible physical damage that can lead people into taking addictive narcotics, and they will die slow and painful deaths without even knowing the primary cause of this. Like if they know that the chloroform doesn't make you invulnerable to pain, but actually more sensitive to it, but you just forget, very few people would accept to go through these procedures. And so, given how dangerous this is, Florent asks the question, would that not be altogether too great a price to pay for progress? So Horkheimer sees in this a sort of poetical justice, that after all the torments that we did to the earth and to animals, this is somehow their revenge. Like the fascist turns his own worldview against himself and causes his own ruin at the end. Quote, the animal would be avenged by the sufferings of its executioner, each operation a vivisection. And so this is the kind of justice in fascist society. This is an impartial justice, a justice that works on all creatures equally. Equally here means the same. We all become the same, like all creatures alike. Like we've been blind to the torments of other species, we must too be blind towards our own torment. So the kind of justice in fascism is just pure blind retributive justice. It doesn't try to stop torment, but to subject everyone to torment and be blind to that torment. The forgetting of our past torment, like when the patient was under chloroform, becomes the forgetting of our own torment as well as that of others. We don't realize that creatures have suffered enough because we keep forgetting it. The fascist is like that. He is as far removed from others as he is from the torment he felt in the past he's forgotten. Caring about others for the fascist is like remembering a torment that he forgot. It's an unsurmountable barrier, as the authors put it. But as Florence asks, is this a price for progress? For the fascist, yes. Progress can only be attained if we all forget the past torment and go along with it, and forget our connections with others, etc. The perennial domination over nature, medical and non-medical technology derives its strength from such blindness. It would be made possible only by oblivion, loss of memory as a transcendental condition of science, or reification is forgetting. So from here, we also get why fascists predict their own ruin. Like they are blind to the torment of others, they must also be blind to their own torment. For the fascist, everyone is in a state where they don't know what is happening to them. There is no point in caring about someone's torment if they cannot remember it, right? It's like for the fascist, everyone has already died. All fates are already sealed. So the asterisk at the end of the note shows that in 1944 the paragraph was quite different, but we should take a look at it, because in this version they focus on the notion of death, that death is, quote, the radical loss of the residual capacity of the nerve substance. Like being unable to feel pain or remember, and not even knowing that we are forgetting something is like being dead. In such view, death would be the reality of the world, while life is the narcosis. It is the state of being under influence. Narcotic is The drug, narcosis, is the state under the influence. So more precisely, the drug reveals that we are in what we are in reality, meaning in reality we are dead. So when we take the drug, that's when we are who we really are, while being alive becomes when we are under the influence of the drug. When you take the drug, you see reality, so you are not under the influence. But when you don't take it, when you are alive, that's when you are under the influence. And so for us, when we interact with others, we behave towards them like the patient behaves towards the period he spent under the influence of the drug. The patient was deluded. He was made to believe something that is not true. And so we behave deludedly towards others. We behave towards them under a false belief. Since we interact with others when they didn't take the drug, but when they are under its influence, then all of their individuality is itself a false belief. I interact with people in life, but since life is the narcosis, then those people don't really exist. All individuation therefore comes off as a false belief. The narcosis acts like the principium individuationis. So this means the principle of individuation, and it is a scholastic concept. That means the principle by which single things are distinguished. It's not specific to just human beings as individuals, but to all things. So when we talk about individuals here, we can mean both individuals as human beings, but also animals, plants, or any physical objects. It is related to space and time, but that's not the point. The point is that principle works only when it admits that it is false, that it is a delusion. In other words, all identities are worthless because they all stem from a state of which they have no memory. We are completely oblivious to who we are, and so the statement, I am Ismail, doesn't mean anything for fascists. Fascists and positivists have this thing in common, they are nominalism. If you remember, nominalism states that there are only physical objects, while abstractions like names and identities don't really exist. And what Florent is talking about is a nominalist doctrine. The science of enlightenment is nominalist, and that's why it can lead to fascism. Quote, the positivists, however, could learn from this how far they have advanced with their science. Their note-taking would be limited in principle to the post-narcotic period. It would be the utterance of a life which had forgotten itself under the influence of narcotics, or rather of death, from which one can remember nothing. They would, in their thing language, have mortificated it. So the utterance of life, or as how science understands life, is to actually say that life is a fiction that because it forgot its reality, which is death, it takes itself to be real. That's why the note-taking of positivists of science is limited to the post-narcotic period, which is the period of the illusion. The post-narcotic period is the narcosis, so what they record are illusions. The reality of what they record is dead, it's just things. That's why they mortificated life, and their language is called a thing language. Everything is reduced to a physical object and nothing more. And what a physical object is just an illusionary appearance. Individuality is the same thing, a physical object, meaning an appearance, and so this paradoxically for Adorno and Horkheimer means that reality is left to some Schopenhauerian metaphysics. Like they say, reality would be left to metaphysics and to antiquated French physiologists. Admittedly, a set of the objective justification of such speculations would call for a discrimination analysis of Schopenhauer's notion, which will contribute too much to Florent's positivism. So what are we talking about here? Well, Adorno and Horkheimer have been complaining that there is no room for metaphysics in enlightenment, and suddenly they say that that reality is left to metaphysics. Here we're talking about the metaphysics of Schopenhauer, and the notion mentioned in the paragraph is the principium individuationis. Schopenhauer talks about it in the 23rd section of the second book of his Word as Representation and Will. In his metaphysics, there is a will, a vital force that moves everything. That will is the essence of all things, and it is completely undifferentiated. You have the will, which is the real state of the world, and then you have everything which are just representations, appearances of that will. So that's the first thing. Everything is a lie. Identities don't exist. They are just representations. And second, the appearances are all subject to the principle of sufficient reason. So to put it in very simple terms, the principle of self-sufficient reason is a deterministic principle. Everything happens for a reason, as we say, but here we mean that everything is predetermined. There is no free will for Schopenhauer. So here Adorno and Horkheimer are linking this to positivism, that it entails determinism, which entails fatalism. Schopenhauer is more complicated than that, and I'm just giving a very simplistic version of the philosophers mentioned briefly by the authors, so don't take this as an accurate account and understanding of Schopenhauer. But the point is that, everything is left to determinism. Everything, like the whole life becomes dead because everything is predetermined, and so everything is left to a metaphysical will, to something that is beyond the agency of individualism, of individuals. And so this is how, fascism works itself in terror. Like, terror basically means the absence of agency. You live under terror when you feel that there's nothing that you can do, and so the entire process of civilization reverts back to the state of nature. Since in the state of nature it was claimed that individuals cannot be themselves because they're constantly under terror, because they're constantly under the natural forces of external forces of the world, in civilization we are supposed to find the opposite, but we find out that even in civilization the same is still operating, that people are still under the influence of this deterministic laws and these deterministic forces. And so what we are going to see next time, which is going to be the last video on Dialectic of Enlightenment, finally, it is the role of philosophy in all of this. Like, philosophy is supposed to give us back the agency and free will so that we break free from this actual terror. And that's it for today. I hope that you enjoyed it. I hope that this made helps you, understanding these concepts and these difficult works. And as always, thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time for our last video on